He is Tony Keith, a poet, writer, and hip hop educational leader, and the author of How the Boogeyman Became a Poet, which is available now. And Tony's poem Views for Damani is also included in the young adult poetry collection Poem Hood, Our Black Revival, and his piece Black Man on Fire won first prize in the Tom Howard Poetry Contest. He's a multi-year fellow of the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities and has featured performances at the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, the Washington National Cathedral, Historic Lincoln Theater, University. Yeah, right, brother. I'm saying I could be reading this for a minute. University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, Busboys and Poets, and many, many more. He's the co-author of Open Mic Night, campus programs that champion college student voices and engagement. And today, I'm excited to speak with him about his work, his most recent release, and his EdMC Academy. Tony, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, sister. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. You got a lot going on, bro.
I got to work on this bio. I mean, and I feel like there's no way to convince this.
A whole bunch. I left out a lot, but I am so impressed with the work that you are undertaking, particularly because you also have this way of making poetry, this educational space, which feels weird to say because we are the original poets. Hip hop is really a form of poetry. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And I want, if we could start with if you could talk with us a bit about how you discovered poetry. What was it for you that sort of sparked this love affair, which has lasted, I'm going to say lifetimes, but some insight into how you came to this space.
Yeah, love that question. And also all the hip hop things. You're just taking me to a really good place right now. The poetry I started writing poetry in third grade. It's actually a part of the memory that I reflect on in this book. It was my teacher did like a poetry unit, and so I wrote a little poem and she loved it apparently and stapled it to like a bulletin board, which, that's a big deal. And this was a Black teacher, right? Here I am like getting awards for like my little poem. And then that same teacher asked me to MC an event for our school principal. And so as early as like third grade, I'm like poet and MC, right? Like those things were just sort of, and so what happened is my grandfather, parents, people around me would always say, Tony is the man with the words. My grandfather called me Mr. Guest Speaker, but I was known as an orator as a kid. And however, the writing I was known for was, for the most part, was like, like creative writing, but only in elementary school. Once I got to like middle and high school and I'm becoming prepared for standardized tests, there was a requirement that I shift a lot of sort of my writing so that it's less creative and more standard. And something that I really experienced, and this is where a lot of the poetry came from, is something that I experienced where I had a lot of white teachers in some of my school, and a lot of them were English teachers, and they would tell me that I spoke wrong, that I wrote wrong. And in this book, I write in African American vernacular English on purpose, by the way. And so I was
Wait, no, say that again. You said that real quick. You talk fast like me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I get very excited.
No, I'm right there with you, but I already know my audience is gonna be like, what? What happened? What happened? So say that again. You write this book and you said African American Vernacular English.
African American Vernacular English, AAVE. Some people might know it as Ebonics, although Ebonics actually means the scholarship or the study of Black language. African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, is kind of the word used in the academic space to refer to the way a lot of Black people just naturally speak. And so I was told I spoke wrong and I needed to articulate better, right? There was sort of this re-understanding, reworking my Blackness and my language. And so there was this fear that I had of being too Black, talking too Black. And then you couple that with the fear of, I think that I'm gay, although I ain't never done that with nobody. I got a girlfriend in high school and I'm trying to figure all this out. And also I'm poor. Like my father was addicted to drugs and alcohol, and my mom was raising me and my sister alone. And so I'm trying to figure out how I'm gonna get to college. And so this book takes place in that moment where all this is going on. So I'm writing poetry when no one is noticing, right? I'm writing poetry to myself to like deal with frustration and sadness and confusion. And so those are the poems that show up in this book. I kept them as an adult, and I copied, so people will see the handwritten ones that I wrote to myself as a kid to just protect myself from all the mess that I was afraid of. And so, it started in third grade, but then evolved into this emotional thing. And then right around senior year, 1999, 2000 is when I write this book. I start performing on stages. That's when I begin to learn about the art of spoken word and, watching Love Jones and sort of seeing this connection between performing poetry on stage for an audience versus the poetry that I was writing to myself.
Mm. So I want to. You dropped so much there, and I realized we might have to make this a two-part conversation because I got 50, 11 questions.
Let's do
But
it.
you
My bad.
said
I'm
that.
sorry. I think I started
No, no,
off
no.
too.
This is
I gave too much.
no. You gave exactly what was needed for this moment, my friend. So you said that you went from being Mr. Words to being told that you write wrong, that you speak wrong. And when you were saying that, it reminded me of one of the students that we've worked with before, and he was a brother who did was considered functionally illiterate, had like a speech IEP situation,
See?
and he had spent time in Rikers, and he ends up at an alternative school where my husband used to work years ago, and we find out that on the streets his name is Lingo. But in school, he can't read. But on the streets, his name is Lingo because he's a wordsmith. But in school, he can't write, he can't read. And my husband looks at his book one day. He's got one of those, black and white composition notebooks, and it's
Yes.
a rhyme book. And you open
See?
up the rhyme book, and we was like, oh my God, you're a genius.
This
Why
is what I'm
do you
saying.
have an IEP that says you can't read and write? And we just explained to him that your hook, I'm saying we, it was Brian really, was explaining to him that your hook is your thesis, right? Your verses are your paragraphs,
Come
and
on.
but was able to meet him where he was at because he's
Yes.
already clearly a wordsmith expert outside, but
Yep.
the genius that he was bringing into the school could not be received. It could not be interpreted.
Yes.
Give us a sense as to what was happening in your mind, and as you're viewing the world, going from being Mr. Words to being told you speak wrong, you write wrong. Talk to us about some of the cognitive dissonance that created for you.
Oh yeah, the language that I have now that I didn't have as a kid for that is internalized racism, right? Like that's what happened is I began to internalize a belief in a hierarchy of races, and that as a black boy, I was at the bottom of that hierarchy, right? Which means that white, like I really believed it was, I literally internalized this, right? And so I adjusted, I literally code switched, right? I learned how to enunciate, and write
Like,
academic. Yeah, I learned how to straighten up and posture, because I was like, in order to get into college, this is what I need to do. And I was the first person in my family to do and so, to do so. And that it's just one of those, and not like there was a lot of pressure from them to do it, but I just had an opportunity that a lot of them just didn't. And so, this moment of like, yo, I can make it, but the only way I can make it is I gotta code switch myself. I gotta kind of stiffen up. And I wound up going to the HBCU, which is a whole part of the story, and then transferring to a predominantly white college institution, PWI. And so just to sort of just experiencing myself as a racial being is what was going on in the cognitive dissonance, trying to understand my blackness, which in this book I write about is something I learned as early, I think 6 years old. I write about this memory of being in a church and this older black man yelled at me and my cousins because we were running around just being busybody. And he said, sit your black behinds down. And I remember being 6 years old, like, well, what does that mean though? Right. And like, is it bad? Like, why can't I run around? Like, why can't I be free? Like, wait a minute, what's going on? And so as early as like 6, I can remember internalizing something about blackness that was just bad.
wow. As I'm hearing you say that, the language that we use, that we have all sort of incorporated, not all, but generally speaking, your cotton picking hands, sit your because we rarely, as you said it, I'm like, okay, is there a space where we say black in relation to something good? Like when we're yelling at our kids and we inject the word black, it also is then adding a connection that this bad behavior that I'm being disciplined for is also connected to my blackness, particularly if we are not on the other side when they're doing something good. Look at your black genius self. Like we're not
Yeah.
bad. So wow, that literally.
Yeah. And so I don't know if we have time for this, but I visited a K through 8 school the other day to do a book talk, which is interesting because my book is written for teenagers, but kindergartners to 8th graders were loving it. I'm happy for it. Anyway, and so one of the young boys, little black boy, he must have been in first or second grade. I guess he thought that I worked at the school. He came up to me and said, I don't understand why we have, because I was doing an assembly for the whole school for an hour. And he says, I don't know why we have to be here. I want to finish taking art, because they were learning about Black Lives Matter in their curriculum all weekend, which is kind of amazing. And he said, and I said, oh, what kind of art were you making? He said, well, we were drawing black people for Black Lives Matter, but we were using the color brown. I don't understand.
Mm.
And so in that moment I read the excerpt from my book when I also was around his age figuring that out. Like just so that's a good question to have, young boy. You know what I mean? You should, yes, but somehow you got to get language to figure out what this means. For me at least I'm glad he understands the brown color, but like he's trying to figure that out. And I'm like, yo, we got to remember kids are figuring this out too, the whole world. It's talking about Black lives. But what are we saying? Kids are trying to figure this out.
Right. And unfortunately, most of our children are not in spaces where either at home or in school where we're having this sort of grappling with the issues kind of conversation. A lot of us are existing in Black lives, but we're not
Yes.
really dissecting Black lives. We're not thinking
Yeah.
or interrogating what all of that means. And so
Yeah.
here's Mr. Words, and then you're going from being Mr. Words to being told that you speak wrong and you write wrong, on top of all the other coming of age challenges. You mentioned trying to figure out whether or not you were gay. You also
Yeah.
had a girlfriend, and the poverty. All of these things are exactly what so many of our kids are navigating today.
Yes.
And yet you were able to, in some way, come back to being Mr. Words.
Yeah.
During this time period where you're sort of navigating these questions that you were having at this time period, were you still maintaining a love affair with poetry, or is it something that you put away to put to the side? How were you able to make this return to go from Mr. Words to reading and writing wrong to now entire books written in
Yeah.
AAC all about this
I
experience?
love that. The word that pops in my head, which I think may help answer this question, is I developed an audience. That's the truth. I was my own audience at one point because I was the one in need of the poems. And it wasn't until I got on stage, my senior year, I write about it. I wrote this poem called Senioritis and performed it on stage at like my high school talent show. And there were like claps, right? Like there was sort of this response from an audience. I'm like, oh, poetry in an audience. Oh, this doesn't have to be like an internal thing. And this doesn't also have to be something external only for teachers. Like this could be something that's external meant for other people. And so in this book, I write about how in college, I learned the difference between, because I attended a poetry slam and I didn't know what a poetry slam was. And then I attended an open mic and then I sort of learned the difference. And so here I dissect this in a book because I'm like, oh, at a slam, you know, it's a competition. There's scores, there's judges, there's usually rules and rounds. An open mic is usually more like get up there, whatever you're feeling, get it on. And we're going to clap for you regardless, right? And so I learned that, oh, I'm not really a slam poet. I mean, I can get busy if I want to, right? But I'm definitely more of like, give me the open mic, give me the freedom to just sort of express myself. So once I began to develop an audience, once I began to hear what my voice sounded like once I began to just recognize the thing that my grandfather told me I was great at, right? That got stifled was still there, right? It never went away. It just got suppressed, right? So once I began to find that my voice and hear it, I was like, oh, we out here. This written word though, this young adult memoir written in verse, it came out of a necessity. I was at a book event with one of my very, very dear friends. Again, I don't know if we have the time for it, but Jason Reynolds just happens to be literally one of
Oh,
my
we
best
love
friends.
Jason Reynolds, and like I
Yeah,
know
yeah,
him in real life, like
yeah.
super
I've
dope
known him for a
brother.
long time. He's a very, very different. And I'm not bringing it up to like talk smack, but he's my homie anyway. And so Jay and I, we were doing an event together at the University of South Carolina, in February of 2020, so a month before COVID hit.
Mm.
And we were doing school visits and talking with groups of young people. I'm talking about my life as a writer on the stage or a poet on the stage. And Jason is also a poet, but talking about himself on the page, like so stage and page. And after every event, there was always this large book signing, and Jay has a lot of books. And so I'm just used to sitting with him at the table, kind of chatting. And this little boy, this black woman gets out of line with her, I'm assuming her son, maybe her nephew, I don't know. Could have been his teacher, I don't know. She brings a little black boy over to me and he says, where's your book? He points at me, where's your book? And as if I had one and I didn't tell him about it or something. It was like an accuse, like the
Wow.
book you have, like where is it? And I was like, I published on the stage. I told him something really stupid. And I smiled and laughed and shook his head. And I was like, I'll catch you later. I went back to my hotel room that night and I was like, yo, what if that little boy was trying to figure something out? Because I'm publicly saying that I'm gay. Like maybe his mother was trying to figure where's the books for him and for her? Where was the book that I needed? And so it became this, there's a need for this book.
Mm.
I
Mm.
needed this book.
You had an audience for this book before you had the book.
Come on.
There
Okay.
was a
Yo,
space for this
so
book.
many black gay men, this is the truth that I'll be 43 this year, I know they're in late 30s, 40s, said they've read this book and was like, yo, Tony, you brought me to tears. I can't like I remember feeling like this. I thought that I was alone. One dude said, Tony, you cured 10 years worth of trauma. I was like, what? But just thinking to myself, like, oh yeah, we were coming up in an age where no, like there wasn't the internet really. There wasn't, we gay men were hiding. It was the height of the HIV AIDS epidemic. We were hiding. So I didn't have any reference Nothing. And neither did these other black gay men who grew, who grew up. And they're like, oh, dudes I went to high school with who are now openly gay, like, Tony, man, you was going through it too. And I'm like, yeah, like,
Oh my God. But then here's one of the challenges that we find is that it's so much easier to sometimes suffer in silence and isolation
mm,
when you don't know that there are other people who are navigating similar challenges as you are.
mm,
And this idea that you had, I keep coming back to the fact that you were Mr. Words and that your family saw in you
yeah.
this gift and were literally, and we talk a lot here about names and how, imagine if your name is, oh, beautiful one who, when the sun rises, it smiles extra hard
Come
because
on.
and every time your mama wants you to go get some water, oh, beautiful one who
Yes, this
rises upon and
the
smiles.
affirmation in the name alone.
Yes. And the ability to use words to pull out a purpose that
Yes.
you might not have even known was there.
Yes, I yeah. I
Easy.
write in this book so much about this is the truth. There's a story I tell about I had a little big head as a little knucklehead, like a big head boy. And my parents called the back of my head a puck, like Puc as in hockey. We did not watch hockey, but anyway, they just told me that my puck had knowledge in it. This is the truth. I was told as a little boy that my head was so big is because it had a bunch of knowledge in it.
Wow.
What that does to a little black boy in a world that's trying to tell you that you ain't, I'm like, nah, but my mama and told me I got, there was this fighting. There was
Right.
enough positive affirmations for the most part to kind of, battle the boogeyman, right? To battle some of that stuff, right? That I needed to just write more and express more of my own voice. But I'm so grateful, seriously, that them telling me that I had knowledge did a thing. I'm the only person in my
So,
family with a PhD right now.
well,
And that
listen,
doesn't mean the other people in my family are not knowledgeable, but like I think it definitely says that y'all implanted something in me that made me believe that I deserve knowing.
that's right. And that's one of the reasons why words have power, right? And
Yeah.
we talk a lot on the show, like whether you are from the Christian tradition or not, that's a tradition that says God saw, God spoke, and so it was, right? So I mean, like words have power. We have the ability, the power of life and death is in the tongue.
Come
I
on.
all my black church girl realities, but
Come
it's what
on. Oh, I write about being a black church in here too, baby. Trust me.
oh, come on, let's talk about it because we know that words from the pulpit have a particular resonance. We know that the oratorical skill is something that we have always long admired. And going back into ancient African history, pre-colonialization and pre-enslavement, we know that the Jelles and the griots and the people who
Yes,
were
ma'am.
able to be wordsmiths
Yes,
had one
ma'am.
of the most revered realms or seats in society. And
Yes.
so thinking about that history, drawing on that history, you could have chosen any particular format, prose, script.
Yeah.
You could have chosen any format. Why did you choose to write a young adult book about your coming of age in a poetic voice? What was it about poetry that said
Yeah.
this is the language of delivery that's going to matter the most?
Ooh, language of delivery. Ooh, that's not a t-shirt. Ooh, to be written, sister. The first thing that I'll say is shout out to, I need to just shout out some black women real quick. And black brown women. Shout out to Mahogany Brown, who wrote Chlorine Sky. Shout out to Candace Elo, them, who wrote Everybody Looking. Shout out to Elizabeth Acevedo, who wrote The Poet X. Like, I just want you to know that they're black and brown folk who've been writing young adult memoirs in verse or novels in verse. Jacqueline Woodson, oh my goodness. And so I just got introduced into this world. And so I want you to know that the verse, it it was me trusting my own way of knowing. This is the truth. This is like it was sort of like I knew that when it's time to write a book, I knew I didn't want it to be stat because I have a PhD and I can write an academic
Right.
thing all day. But I was like, this got to be fun and enjoyable and interesting, and it's got to reflect my way of knowing. And I think poetically, I write poetically, I speak poetically. I'm like, and I'm like, I want a lot of imagery. Like, I want to like throw all of the suppressed creative arts that I wasn't able to express in like I want to throw all of it in this book. And so what's interesting is I usually write things justified to the left. But in this book, again, after reading so many work by so many others, I was
Being
like, oh, I
facially
can,
on the page, justified.
yeah,
Okay, because I
yeah.
know
I was like,
somebody heard like,
I'm like, I can play. Yeah, I was like, I can play with the page. I do things in the book where it looks like the words are falling off the page, or there's my editor, shout out to Ben Rosenthal at HarperCollins, was like, Tony, you have like expand. And so that's what happened. And so verse naturally came, but also I realized that it was a particular writing genre that I didn't know anything about. The other thing is I also thought about, this is the truth, adults, especially, and I'm specifically going to be honest here. I was thinking about Black adults that I know who do not like to read or just don't really have a great relationship with literature, right? My mom, so many others, right? Who they're not reading for pleasure, right? And so I was teaching an English language arts class at an adult public charter school in Washington, D.C. My students were individuals working on their GEDs, high school credentials, whatever. My oldest student was 65. I had them reading excerpts of my book in PDF format when I had it in PDF. And I had them also reading Jacqueline Woodson has a memoir in verse called Brown Girl Dreaming. It is beautiful, but it's written for younger readers and it's written all in verse and rhyme. My students globbed, I mean, they soaked it up. They ate it up. And it was something about the presentation of the text on the page that made them less fearful to read it. But also the sound of me reading it to them, the fact that it's written in verse, y'all have to hear the audiobook because I have this and I self-narrated my own audiobook. And so I performed 352 pages of verse, right? And so to hear someone speak words that you're reading on the page, it connected so many dots for their literacy. So I was thinking about that too, was like the ways in which I really hope this does something with Black people's literacy,
Yeah.
adult learners, younger learners, even teachers. Like,
Yeah, so this raises for me a couple of questions because
sure.
I've sort of tongue-in-cheekily referenced many times over the past couple of weeks that Americans tend to read at about a sixth grade level. And it's
Mhm.
come up in a lot of, conversations online, more pejorative conversation online, like you can't even read beyond sixth grade, like sort of, but like
Yeah.
there's a real national pandemic, if you will,
Yes.
of low literacy levels. And
Yes.
we have a lot of functionally illiterate folks in our community. We've had a number of folks on. We had one brother on who he's very publicly said, I'm 30 something years old. I don't know how to read. And he's
Yep.
training himself to read on social media, trying to share
Yep.
his story. But there's something about verse.
Yes.
I don't know if it's because we have hip hop as sort of one of our verse driven mediums, but there's something about verse that is, when it's verse about stuff that we care about, not like, and she forsooketh her lover on the high
Yes.
of the English plate. Like, not like that, but I mean, like in our language, talking about what we care about,
Yes.
inciting for us. There's something easier, I think, about the ability to
Mhm.
gravitate towards verse in our community in AAVE when it's written about topics we care about than reading like an
Yes.
actual, just traditional,
Yes.
traditional, a standardized book. Talk to us a little bit about the role that hip hop has played in sort of opening up our ability to use verse as a learning tool, as a
Yeah.
literacy teaching tool.
Yeah, I love that because the first word that pops in my brain and when you said all that is performance. If anything, hip hop taught me how to perform words, right? And so, like thinking about writing this book, verse for me is like a performance of words on the page, a performance of language on the page, right? Like I can make these things dance and swirl around. I can make people think about things. Like I can just like put a microphone on page one. You know what I mean? Like just like and so like for me, it's about performance. But when it comes to hip hop, this is what's really important. Is for me, I'm like, yo, again, I'll be 43 years old, and we know we celebrated 50 years of hip hop, last year. And I'm like, yo, I don't know a world without hip hop in it. But when I talk about hip hop, I was just sharing this recently with someone before. I was like, yo, I know hip hop culture. And when I think about the word culture, culture has music and food and dance and language and philosophies. And I'm like, yo, in the 90s, when I was becoming aware of hip hop culture, I was wearing Timberland boots and baggy jeans and saying fresh and fly and dope and
Oh,
doing certain kind of dances. I was absorbing culture. Hip hop culture's music is rap music. Now, rappers, shout out to Tupac Shakur and Queen Latifah and Lauryn Hill and Moni Love, so many others who KRS-One, who in their rhymes refer to themselves as poets, right? And so I'm always like, yo, rap ain't nothing but poetry spoken over a time beat that must rhyme. You need meters and bars, and I don't need that as a spoken word artist. I can do whatever I want, but like understanding that there's a musical sort of element to rap music, but it's poetry, right? And at least I make the argument that like some of the best MCs and rappers are the best poets, right? Like, so, oh my goodness, like fire poets. And so for me, that's where that relationship comes from. So being able to perform poetry comes from being a kid watching people like perform hip hop. So I write in the book a memory I have of my junior year of high school. I'm performing the rock and roll version of All About the Benjamins with my friends on like a talent show, and I'm doing Jadakiss' part. I'm out there rapping. You know what I mean? And I'm not a rapper. You know what I mean? But teaching like the performance, hip hop gives you confidence, right? Because
yeah.
there's a reception that you're getting, right? The audience is like clapping and getting. You're like, yeah, I got this mic. Like
Who can't
people
read?
probably couldn't see
I
all
mean,
that production I just gave, but it was all.
oh, they'll see it on it'll get to YouTube. They'll see it in a minute. They'll see it in a minute. So that, Because I wrestle with hip hop because as a parent, as an educator, as an advocate, like because I know the power of words, and we've had scientists who've come on and talked to us about the fact that jazz musicians and people who engage in musicality there are some portions of their brain that are more muscularly developed because of all of the many learning opportunities that music and linguistics can provide. So I wrestle because I'm like, to have this very, very powerful medium teaching. I don't want you knowing how to cook it and track it and package it and distribute. Like, I don't want to be using the most powerful educational device in that way. And so I love the fact that I'm being reminded in real time that that's not the only way that tool is being used. It is
absolutely,
also
absolutely.
This space.
Yeah, and within the context of hip hop history, if people really sort of understood the story and the history, there are at least 5 elements to hip hop. There's DJs, there's MCs, there's graffiti writers or street writers, there's break dancers. People even break dancing is a part of the Olympics now. Nobody knows that this came from Black and brown poor kids in the South Bronx, right? Like, come on, right? But then there's also this element, fifth element. Shout out to Africa Bambaataa, knowledge of self. The more you know about who you are, the more powerful you are. You can show up into the world, right? And I'm like, yo, I know hip hop. I didn't know that then as a kid, but as an adult, I know that now. Meaning, I'm a Black gay man who's hip hop, right, and well respected and especially within the context of education. And I'm not a rapper. And this is what I mean by that is like, yo, there are ways in which we can embody hip hop culture and it not be about mainstream music that's not controlled by us. Right. Mainstream music that's controlled by folks who want to profit off of the language and the lyrics that ain't got nothing to do with what hip hop was started. I remember growing up, I could hear De La Soul and I don't know, Luke. You know what I mean? Like there was at least some balance, right? I would make the argument that I don't know if there is enough balance or it's safe space for the balance. I listen to local artists. I listen to, I find a playlist that's got like stuff that's not being played on, I love me wrong. I ain't knocking mainstream media. I will never hurt people who got a check. But I'm just saying, when I think about consuming hip hop,
hurt us, I might.
Oh, it's fine. But I'm like, yo, when it comes to consuming hip hop's music, I'm just intentional about the kinds that I consume, and I don't consume stuff that's not talking about peace, love, unity, and having fun.
I love it. We literally have like a minute left, and I'm sure there's someone in the audience thinking, well, what if I'm not a Black gay man? Is this book even gonna have anything relevant for me? And to which I would say, have you ever had a coming of age moment? Because if so, then yes, there is something here for you. But what would you say to that question? If you're not a Black gay man or wrestling with what it means to have come of age as someone navigating that story, Tony Keith, what would you say to someone who has that question?
I would say if you have that question, I would then ask yourself, have you ever written or read a poem? Whether in school or out loud or your mama, but what is your relationship to poetry? Did you ever write a poem? Yeah. What was that experience like? And I would start there. Everybody, I think, could at least have some.
Yes, exactly. And all of us have come of age. All of us have grappled with questions about love, who we are, who we want to be, and whether or not there's a place for us in this world. And so I often tease my audience sometimes. Like, I know some of us are pronoun challenged. So if I don't say he and she, then you're not going to see yourself in it. And I encourage them to do what women have had to do, which is when, in the religious space, when all they say we were just told, well, that meant you too. So like, this means you too. All right. You can find connection.
Collective.
My whole life, learning how to connect to a spiritual deity who was told to be a man, was able to incorporate me too. I think stretch a little bit and see so much universality in the human experience of navigating.
Ashe. And I'll just say the last thing is I always tell people I write to Black gay men and boys and the people who love us. So if you love me, then this book is absolutely for you. Ain't gotta look like me, but if you love me, like deep down, like you're a human being and I love you, then this book is for you too.
He is Tony Keith, poet, writer, hip hop education leader. Oh my God, we didn't talk about the EdMC Academy.
We did not. That's okay though. What you all this experience is what an EdMC does in education. Y'all can find us. There's a whole academy of poets, spoken word artists, rappers, and educators out here doing some amazing work. Book us.
Well, we're going to make that the quick version, but we are going to ask you to come back to specifically talk
I
with
would
us
love to.
this academy, because that the institutionalizing around our art form is also something that I care about a lot. He is amazing. Y'all already know how I feel. You can tell and hear it in my voice. The author of How the Boogeyman Became a Poet, available right now. He is Tony Keith. Tony, where should people go to find you, connect with you on social media? What's the best way?
Fantastic. www.tonykeithjr.com and on all social media things at Tony Keith Jr. Hope to see ya.